Okay, let's jump in here and get going and see where we end up today. Okay, so I think everybody should have gotten feedback on their mini lab. Is that the case? Okay, that was Joe. I didn't actually go. Joe's really nice. He's very honest. And so I usually go and tone down his comments a little bit. So if I didn't check this time how honest they were. And I think my experience with Joe, he's really good, but he knows his stuff, but he tends to hold people to like graduate level standards. So I do usually check his comments, and I just didn't get a chance to this time. Because occasionally he may say things that are honest. Very honest, if you will. So I'm sorry if you got a very honest comment. I usually do try to check his work to tone down his honesty while still being honest. But like I said, he knows his stuff really, really well. So the feedback's always good. He did one time potentially tell a student that this was the worst assignment he'd ever seen, and I had to dial that back a little bit. But generally, it's on point. So anyway, just let me know if he gives me really harsh comments, and I'll have a chat with him. But like I said, he knows his stuff so well. Okay, so, I was just gonna say one thing about this slideshow. I took a few slides out. I was looking at them just before class, and there's slides on reliability, and I'm just like, I feel like y'all really don't need to know all of those things at this level, right? So I took like 4 slides out. So we're just gonna go straight to validity once we get there. So you're gonna see in your slides, mine are gonna skip ahead by 4 slides, because I was just like, I'm looking at them and I'm like, do my students really need to know this, right? Do you need to know that, this is checked with Cronbox Alpha? It's like, okay, no. We're introducing methods. Let's not get too hung up on like incredibly like minutia that you'd figure out in like advanced methods or advanced stats and all of these things. So I kind of took those out. Okay. Any questions before I jump in today to content? Yeah. Like on the exam? No, I'll make sure to take any questions that relate to that off of the exam. So you don't have to worry about, questions or content that I removed being on the exam, because I don't do that. That's not fair. So yeah, I would definitely take those out. So I don't even know if there ever were any, because it's honestly, it's very minutia, and it's less important to me than some of the other things in terms of what I think you need to know in terms of methods. Okay, any other questions? All right, let's do it. Okay. So, sorry, we ended, I guess, here, we were talking about indicators, and specifically, multiple indicators to measure a concept, being useful for getting a stronger read, right? And I think, one indicator can be enough. I think you almost always want multiple indicators to figure things out, and especially, there's a couple, it allows for things like, factor analysis and cluster analysis, right, which is useful once you learn how to do that with statistics, in SPSS or R or Python potentially, it's really useful to do. And then response sets, helping to weed out response sets, right, especially when you start to offer financial rewards or points or something. People may just, go through the motions of like filling out your surveys as quickly as possible in order to basically, get the reward, get the points at the end of the day, or the chance to win $500 or whatever it happens to be, rather than honestly filling out your survey. It was weird because I did one over the weekend, right? I saw this on Reddit, and there was a survey from University of Calgary Department of Psychology on was it marriage and infidelity, and I was like, usually I try to fill out surveys for people when I can, because having done survey research, I'm like, okay, I need to like be a mensch, and when other people have survey research they're trying to do that I can answer, I want to fill it out. And weirdly, like they clearly had a strategy of trying to weed out response sets, at the end of, which I don't think works very well actually. I hope they have a better way to do it. But they had asked at the end of the survey, they had 2 questions. One was like, did you fill out this survey honestly? And it's like, yes? Like, no, I filled it out dishonestly, haha. And then the follow-up question was, do you think we should include your data in our data set? And I'm like, God, I mean, this thing took me 45 minutes to do. I really hope you include my data. No, but obviously I said yes. I think that was a way to read out response sets, to be like, you know, if you get to the end and you're like, nah, I just did this as fast as possible. And don't include my data, but I want my points. Actually, I think it was, you could win a chance to win a $100 gift card or something. Anyway, they said it was a 1 in 3 chance, but I feel like that's not good enough. I feel like that's, I don't know how they could manage that. If they're hoping to get like 400 or 500 samples, that would be a huge amount. Anyway, neither here nor there. That's a way of trying to get response sets, right? Where someone is like, answers, you know, for every question, you know, strongly agree or something like that, you know, or I would totally cheat on my partner or whatever. I can't remember how they phrased it in the survey I did. But yeah, that's the kind of thing that you can, when you have multiple indicators, you can see where response sets are, especially, like I said last time, if you do a kind of inversion question where you ask a question and it's negative, right? So it's like, I believe in God, and you're like, strongly agree. I don't believe in God, and they also answer strongly agree. You know you're in a response set scenario, right? Where they're not paying attention to your questions. Or something like that. Okay. So, and when we get to surveys, like our next topic, I believe, is survey research. When we get to surveys, right, we're going to talk a lot about Likert scales, and we'll walk you through how to like make sure you're using them correctly. That's very echoey in that one corner. Maybe it's because the ceiling tiles are missing, so the asbestos can really get in here. I think they've done abatement on this floor, actually, maybe. We're all going to die. Eventually. Okay, so Likert scales, right? So Likert scales are a really, really common way of phrasing survey questions and survey responses in particular. They're really, really useful. And the reason that they're really useful, and what I would tend to encourage people to use Likert scales, like it doesn't have to be the strongly agree to strongly disagree one, though it's a really common one. They're really useful in surveys because one of the things you have to worry about when you're doing a survey is basically people quitting your survey, right? I mean, there's always a balance, like how long can it be? How many questions can you have? How long is reasonable to ask people to kind of sit there and take your survey? These kinds of response sets, right? So a Likert scale is really useful because it basically saves people a lot of thought, right? And one of the things that you're going to run into with surveys is the longer they are, the more people are going to tend to get exhausted by them as they move through the survey. So one of the easy ways to kind of avoid this and make sure that people are answering in a way that makes sense is to create these scales that basically you're going to reuse from question to question, right? And like I said, it doesn't have to be the strongly agree to strongly disagree one. That's a really common one. You know, if you're asking about frequency, you know, you can have like daily, weekly, monthly, yearly, seldom, never, right? And you reuse that kind of frequently. But the idea behind Likert scales is that you use them so that when a person is taking your survey, they can read the question, right, this part, and very quickly know what they're going to answer without having to read a unique response set for every single question. And I can tell you that reading response sets for every single question is exhausting, right? Like 20 questions in, your brain is tired because you're like constantly interpreting, and if someone has like 6 options, it can be really tiring, right? And sometimes I see this, right? It's like, let's say you were doing a survey on education, you want to figure out let's say your research question is, you want to figure out the link between the kind of clothing people buy and their level of education. And your first question is like, how important, so you've asked them what their education is. How important is the brand of clothing you buy? And your options are like, it is very important to me that I buy brands that are from luxury retailers. And then the next one is, it's very important to me that I buy brands from, from companies that produce things in an environmentally friendly way. And then you have like a bunch of these with like long descriptions. You're gonna get a bunch of like bad responses, and you're probably gonna get people that quit, right? Now, if you ask those same questions, instead of having those response sets, you're like, it is important to me to buy luxury brands. Strongly agree to strongly disagree, right? Okay, that's question one. It's important to me to buy from manufacturers that are environmentally conscious. Strongly agree to strongly disagree. You're going to get, a better response. People are going to stick with it longer because they don't have to think about, which one of these, 25-word descriptions applies to me. So they're really useful, and it's, especially as you're like starting out trying to figure out how you're going to write surveys, they're a really easy shorthand so that you don't have to switch response sets all the time, and you can write survey questions pretty efficiently and get good responses, right? So usually the respondent asks if their level of agreement with the statement, or like a frequency, or something like that, right? But basically a consistent scale you use over and over again. Okay, and then the items must be statements. So especially when you're dealing with I'll say this doesn't always have to be true. Like if you're asking about the frequency of something, you don't have to make a statement, or you can. Like I attend, religious services weekly, or I attend religious services and then leave it blank for them to answer, but you could ask a question there. But in anything where you're using like level of agreement, right, how much someone agrees with a statement, you absolutely have to make sure it is a statement and not a question. And I say this knowing that some people will still get this wrong. I had on last semester one student who made this mistake and then was upset with themselves for making it. But it was something to the effect of, do you? Let me think about. I'm trying to remember what the question was. Or let me put it in my environmental folder. Do you think that companies should produce clothing in an environmentally friendly way? Strongly agree. It doesn't make sense, right? You can't strongly agree with a question. You can strongly agree with a statement, I believe, but you can't strongly agree with a question. Like, do you believe? Can you strongly agree with do you believe? You can't, right? So if you're using things, and especially like rate agreement scales, make sure that you're making a statement, right? That it's some kind of statement, right? And these are, so the ones that are up on the screen, I took out of a survey that I wrote a few years ago when I was doing research on Catholic institutions in Edmonton, right? And you can see, right, Catholic schools that receive government fund, like it's pretty long. Receive government funding should be allowed to operate in keeping with Catholic values, even if they conflict with values held by other members of society. For example, hiring only teachers who are Catholic, or not permitting gay-straight alliances to operate in schools, right? So that's the statement, and then they rate their level of agreement with it, and we did this for a whole bunch of different Catholic organizations and asked in different ways. Yeah, please.
So, questions rule, is that just because, it doesn't technically make sense, or is there, a logistic reason why? If you had a question like you just gave your example, people would get what and know what's technically correct. So, is it just...
Yeah, so you want to be as clear as possible, right? Because, most people will get what you're saying, but you need to make, especially with survey research, you need to make people's work easy, right, when they're taking your survey. So if they're reading it and they don't understand, right, and not everybody's first language is necessarily going to be English, right? People might have, you have a high level of English. You might have someone, taking it whose, level of English is high school or whatever, right? So you need to make sure that it's super accessible and that people are going to easily understand it. That was not a terrible example. I've seen some much worse ones, right, where it's just literally doesn't make sense, right? It's like you ask a question like, should the government ban cats? strongly agree, right? It doesn't fit with the question and the scale. Is like, I think the government should ban cats. I don't know why the government would ban cats. They're lovely creatures. I just came up with a random example in my head. Chihuahuas, on the other hand, terrible creatures, should be banned by the government. I was bitten by a chihuahua once, and I'm still sore about it. It was my friend's chihuahua. It's a monster. It was a rescue dog, rescued chihuahua. I don't know. Anyway, I'm gonna get off the story. But yeah, I mean, you can see like you can figure it out what the person's trying to ask, but it can be kind of unclear, right? And there's lots of ways that it can be phrased that it's like, you know, it gets more and more unclear, and I could probably dig up some examples that are really unclear where people have used these kinds of scales, and it ends up creating really, really big problems for you. And then people just can't answer, right? Because it's like, I don't know how I'm supposed to agree with a question. Well, it can ruin your data because if people aren't able to interpret it properly, you know, people can answer in all sorts of ways, right? Or not answer or quit, right? And that's another, desistance is a huge problem with surveys that you want to avoid. So you need to make it like easy on my brain when I'm reading your survey. Otherwise I will quit. And I do quit surveys all the time. I'm like, I'm going to do this because I'm a good person and I want to support other researchers. And I'm like, man, this survey is too long and hard. Goodbye. Anything that asks me to rank like 20 different brands, I'm like, I'm tired of this and I don't want to do it anymore. But yeah, go ahead.
So questions can be asked, but then like the responses that you give, they should match, or like they should make sense when recorded.
They have to, yeah. So like if you're asking for a level of agreement, you can't ask a question. If you're asking for like frequency of something, you could like, how often do you do like, you know, how often do you go to the racetrack, right? Okay, well, daily, weekly, you know, so how often do you gamble? Those ones you can use a response set, like a Likert scale, but in that case it makes sense, right? Because you're using one that makes sense. So yeah, when you're looking at it, make sure it makes sense. Yeah, they all have to relate to the same object, right? So you can't have, I'm trying to think, like strongly agree, sometimes, you know, seldom, somewhat disagree, you know, would rather go to the racetrack. Like, that's obviously a ridiculous example, but the scale should all be kind of consistent, right? They should all be consistent, and they should all be, you know, related, right? So these are all levels of agreement. If you're using levels of agreement, right, you want to see whether people agree to things. Really common in political polling and political surveys. You know, you want to make sure that everything has to do with agreement or disagreement. You know, you don't want to shift your scale to something else like frequency or anything like that. Because then people, again, are going to be confused and they can't pick the right answer. And more often than not, it's going to either jumble your data or they're just going to stop, right? And stop again. Survey desistance, and at which point, right, even if they're down to the very last question and they quit at the last question, you have to toss the data set, right? You can't use it, especially if that's written into your ethics, which it should be. Okay, so does that make sense? I should, before I skip on, like, move on, sir. Okay, coding. I'm just gonna mention coding in this class, right? Like, it's a really important part of the research process. Okay. Especially in qualitative, coding is even more important, but we do a bunch of it in quantitative research as well. So typically, when you need to make codes is because you've created, let's say on a survey, an open question, right? So an open question would be where instead of giving people a response set, right, these are the options that I want you to, you know, to answer. Instead, I'm gonna give you like an open text box, right? Which is like, or like I'm thinking online surveys, or you ask someone a question, could you tell us in your own words, blah, 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 right? I guess like on the spot surveys that you do at the end of the semester, at least 3% of you do them, I swear. You know, that's the text box where you can comment on your professor's teaching. If you were gathering that data in order to kind of do something with it, you need to code it, right? So basically, and this is, you know, especially in quantitative research, coding this kind of data can be a big pain in the butt. Just because, you know, if everybody answers things and they give multiple sentences, you could have 400, 1,500, 3,000 surveys that you need to code data off of, right? So things that you need to do, right? You need to identify, basically codes are you label themes, right? Themes that you find or statements into sort of categories so that you can then turn them into numbers so that you can measure them. In quantitative research, right, when you see codes, right, you put an open text box like, what do you think of, you know, the president of the University of Alberta, or please tell us in your own words what you think about student experience at the University of Alberta. And you would have to go through there and you know, so people are like, you know, tuition is too high. So every time you find in, you know, in those statements, tuition is too high or something relating to tuition being high, you label that a 1. And then, you know, not enough student clubs, okay, that's a 2. When you create codes, right, it's a hard work and it can be very dull. But basically you have to create them so that the categories don't overlap, right? So you can't have, your goal is anyway, that any given statement is going to fall into one category and not another, and they should be exhaustive. So basically, you know, if you're going through the data, you should be able to code every single statement that people make according to your code. So you have to keep generating codes until you've basically categorized every piece of data that you got from your participants, right? So, and yeah, especially, and this is, quantitative research is tricky this way. Qualitative research doesn't have to be in the same way, because often, especially at the master's and PhD level, you're the only one handling your data. But when it comes to quantitative research and you're dealing with hundreds or thousands of open statements that you have to categorize, you're probably not going to be able to do that all yourself as the researcher, right? You're likely going to be working with some kind of team. And in that case, right, you need to have clear rules as to how things are coded so that you get, you know, basically intercoder objectivity, right? So you're getting the same coding, things are being coded in the same way by different observers. So, you know, like me and my colleague Sheila, who's not a real person, are both working on coding the data. So we're looking at, you know, statements about student experience and tuition in particular. You know, I would, you know, you don't want her coding things, you know, saying, oh, this is a code of neutral, you know, about tuition versus, you know, me being like upset about tuition if we're looking at similar statements. We need to make sure we're coding things in the same way. And that's one of the challenges, right? Now, usually this is accomplished through training, right? Where people sit down and you go through a training session and you talk through the code book and you look at different statements, but it is a problem that often, you know, you end up having to go back in the code book and fix stuff. Okay, I think this is where it jumps forward, because I decided just to leave reliability out. Okay, so measurement validity, right? We're talking about measurement validity. So basically, we can talk about, you know, so validity, right, concerned with whether you're measuring what you want to measure, right? We talked about validity a little bit already. And there's basically 4 kinds of measurement validity. And they're, you know, they range from easy to understand to slightly obtuse in terms of what you need to do to understand them. Okay, so face validity. So this is the one you're going to be asked to do on your, I think on your second mini lab and on the major lab as well, is face validity. And face validity is really pretty simple, right? It's on the surface, right? On the, like at first glance, are you measuring, does your measure appear to be valid? Does it seem like you're measuring what you want to measure, right? So if you're asking about, you know, religiosity, right? You want to find out if people are religious. Is frequency of prayer on the surface a good measure of religiosity? Does it make sense to measure religiosity based on frequency of prayer, right? I think that one would fit. Now, let's say you wanted to measure religiosity, and you wanted to say, well, I'm going to measure religiosity by how often someone drives past a religious congregation, right? Okay, so on its face, would just driving past religious congregations, right? So you drive past a church every day on your way to work. Would that meet face validity in terms of measuring religiosity? Probably not, right? Because, you know, you're not really measuring someone's behavior, you're measuring something that's passively in their environment. Now, if subjective level of belief, right? At least theoretically, that's on its face, it makes sense, right? Attendance, like religious service attendance, could be a good measure of religiosity, and mostly it seems to fit on face value. When you dig a little deeper, it might not make sense, but that's okay. When you're talking face validity, you're just talking about on the surface. Like, does it seem plausible that you could measure, that you could measure religiosity by religious service attendance? It seems to make sense, right? And same thing, could you measure, wealth by how many boats someone owns, right? Would that be on its face a good measure of wealth? What do you think?
Sort of yes, because if you own a lot of boats, you definitely have a lot of money, but also very much no, because just because you have money doesn't mean you have a lot of boats.
Right, exactly, right? So it could, but it might not. So it's on its face, it's probably not a great measure of wealth. It would be a great measure of wealth for some people, right? And then also, what are you counting as boats? If I count a canoe, if I own 3 canoes, am I now wealthy versus someone who owns a yacht, right? Like, it potentially can be, but in other cases it wouldn't be. So I think it fails the face validity test. I can think of other examples. Now I'm only coming up with like the most ridiculous examples in my brain. I'm like, could we measure femininity by the number of stuffed animals someone owns? Probably fails on face validity as well, right? Because it doesn't speak to behavior, it just speaks to some other random measure, right? So yeah, face validity, but could you measure it by self-identification? That's probably a better measure on the face, right? Simply because, you're actually dealing with something people actually believe about themselves, right? Okay. So face validity is pretty easy, right? So just think of it when you're asked to give face validity, why? Just like at a basic level, is this a good way to measure it, right? I think I talked about, sorry, I'm now rambling about face validity. Even though I don't like GPA as a metric of academic achievement, on its face, it makes sense, right? Because it's a reflection of the grades you receive during a semester, so it kind of makes sense in that way. Okay, so that's measurement validity. The other ones are all a little bit more, I guess, in the weeds, and a little bit less straightforward, and they're less applicable on a broad level, which is why I'm not necessarily asking you to use them in your major labs. Okay, so concurrent validity, right? So concurrent validity, basically when you talk about concurrent validity, so basically if your measure, corresponds or correlates with some other criterion that seems to be relevant to the concept, you can say that there is concurrent validity. So basically, if there's no correlation, you can't say that there's concurrent validity, they're not measuring the same thing, or your measure isn't measuring things properly. So, I've got an example in my brain that could work. Basically, they're looking for concurrent validity if you have 2 measures or assessments taken roughly at the same time. If you compare the new assessment, or you compare both of them together, and if they're showing you roughly the same thing, you can say that they are concurrently valid, right? So, for example here, right, if you had student evaluations of teachers and professional assessments, right? So let's say that when you do the SPOT survey, right, you, at the same time, and this is a fantasy world because we don't do it this way, there was somebody coming into this classroom and evaluating my teaching, right? So one of the faculty comes in and evaluates my teaching and rates my teaching on a similar scale, right? Something that can be kind of compared. If those 2 things kind of show, the similar results, you can say that they have concurrent validity, right? That basically they're measuring similar things and one measure kind of supports the other, right? So basically 2 separate measures that are measuring the same thing, that if they kind of show similar results, you get kind of similar measurements out of them, you can say that they're concurrently valid, right? That they're both showing the same thing, right? Or, I mean, even if, I guess, sorry, I'm trying to think here. There should be some kind of correlation between the two, right? Otherwise, you're going, let's say that the professional assessment shows that I am the most fabulous teacher and I get absolutely terrible spot reviews from the students. In theory, right, that would show that there's something wrong with one of those measures. One of them isn't measuring validly what you're attempting to measure, right? So you want the two measures to kind of be used differently, but show similar things. Does that make sense? Okay. Yes? Okay. Okay, construct validity. Basically, it has to do with whether your measure, whatever your concepts relate to each other in a way that's consistent with your theory, right? So, basically, to see construct validity, you want to see that what you're measuring is actually, like what you're trying to get, your measurement actually corresponds with the way you've constructed a concept in your theory, right? So typically, right, this would be, is confirmed by seeing the results match what would be predicted given the theory, that you're actually, that in your construct, like in the way you've constructed a concept in your theory, right? You are wanting, again, I'm going to go back to religiosity because I know the measures really well. You want to measure religiosity. And so you come up with, your measures of religious service attendance, prayer, and say subjective belief in God, right? And your theory is that, younger people are going to have less religious salience or less religiosity, for XYZ reasons, because they're younger, it's less relevant to them, they're more individualistic, and whatever. So if you find that then backs it up, at least in your construct, where you've constructed your notion of religiosity, right, it fits, right? You've correctly created a theory that then you pull out of the data some information that's valid, right? Okay. So, does that make sense? I know, super fun. When we get to surveys, I promise, much more fun. Okay, so convergent validity. Basically, you get convergent validity if a measure of a concept correlates with a second measure, right? So basically, typically in one kind of sitting, typically using a different measurement technique, and the best one here that I can think of is the flipped question technique, right, or the opposite phrasing. So if, the measure of a concept correlates with a second measure that uses a different technique, so here you could have a positive framing and a negative framing, right? If both of them show you the same thing, you can see that they have convergent validity, right? Or if you wanted to measure religiosity and you wanted to use one that focuses on behavior and one that focuses on feelings of belonging and questions that focus on belief, right? These are different techniques, so you're asking different types of questions. You can say that if all of these kind of show the same thing, you have a sort of convergent validity, right? But you're measuring things differently, different types of questions about different sorts of things. If they all kind of work together, you can say you have convergent validity. But I like the flipped answer one because it's really easy. Like if you ask the question both positively and negatively, you can say that you're measuring the right thing because you've measured it using a positive statement and a negative statement. So hopefully that makes sense. All right. So I think we talked. Ooh, that coffee's getting strong at the bottom. We talked about reliability and validity earlier in the course, but basically, right, when we talk about reliability, a measure that's not reliable won't be valid, right? So you essentially, right, you can have statements that are not reliable or valid, statements that are reliable but not valid, and statements that are, or data that are both reliable and valid, right? And basically, right, so I talked about, I think I gave the example of weight, right? So, you're wanting to measure your weight, and you step on the scale and it gives you your weight accurately, and every time you step on the scale it gives you the same number, you're reliable and valid. If you step on the scale and it shows you plus 100 pounds, it's reliable, and every time it's always plus 100 pounds, it's reliable but not valid. And if it's all over the, right, because you're reliably getting results, but it's not measuring the right thing. And then if it's, you know, here and you step on the scale and one time it gives you 1 pound and then 300 and then 12 and then 45 and then 62 and then 196, right? You can say it's not reliable and not valid, right? But if something isn't reliable, right, it can't be valid, right? If you're not getting a reliable measurement, you know, getting consistent results, it's not going to be valid, right? But yeah, it can be invalid but still reliable. Like I said, you know, you can get similar results but somehow be measuring an incorrect concept, right? You can get very consistent results, like, you know, if you're plus 100 on the scale, right, it's reliable, but it's not valid, right? Okay, does that mean, I think I explained this before as well, so I won't go over it as well again. Okay, so main goals of quantitative research is what? Measurement, right? We want to put things into numbers, right? Data are used to understand or quantify social phenomena. We want to quantify things. We want to put things in numbers, you know, concepts, and their interrelation. Quantitative research is all about, you know, statistics and putting things together in a way that we can measure numerically to try and get as objective of measurements as possible. And then establishing causality, right? We want to know what causes social phenomena. And this is really, really, really difficult. And I think I said, you know, last class, that sometimes the directionality of these things, we have to sort of theorize at the direction of causation. And sometimes we make really good guesses, and sometimes you know, we may get them inverted depending on the phenomena. Because it's really hard to establish causation 100%. Ultimately, we want to establish causality, but, you know, most of the time we're going to stick to correlative statements and say, I think the causality is this direction. Okay, yeah, I guess the other one that's really important is generalization, right? We want to generalize findings to those not studied. And, you know, because quantitative researchers generally are not interested in studying just a small group. They want to take that small group, you know, whatever it is, 400, 1,500, 3,000, and make generalizations about the whole of society or the whole of a group or the whole of, a social setting, right? So the goal is to come up with, you know, law-like findings or theories that should be applicable to large numbers of people, right? So you could say that, you know, all Edmontonians, you know, kind of fall into this. You know, I've generalized about, you know, all Roman Catholics feel this way, or the majority of them do. And we can say, you know, people who, you know, are socioeconomically poorer, you know, there's some qualities that we can say they share, right? Yeah, particularly, it's of particular concern for researchers using cross-sectional or longitudinal designs. You generally don't want to just be stuck talking about a single group, right? You want to talk about all American teenagers or all Canadian teenagers, right? You want to make these pretty broad claims about society. Yeah, the experimental model, which we don't need to talk about too much again, is concerned more with internal validity than external validity in quantitative research, and it's a little bit unique. And again, we don't do it much in sociology. Okay, so the key to all of this is having a representative sample, right? So we'll talk about probability sampling as we go forward here. I promise it's really, really, really important. Representative sample, right? When we talk about a representative sample, representative only of the population from which it was taken, right? So if we survey Canadians, right, it's only representative of Canadians. If we survey Americans, right, it's only of Americans. Edmontonians, only representative of Edmontonians, right? So you couldn't say if you surveyed people in Edmonton, right, that then you would generalize your findings to, you know, people in Calgary. It's like probably Calgarians or Torontonians are the same. Torontonites? No, Torontonians. So you can only make generalizations about that whole population. And that's sort of the limit of it. You know, you do have a population of which you're taking a sample. Now, like a representative sample, generally you're drawing it, you know, at random from a given population. Drawing it randomly doesn't guarantee representativeness, but it improves the chances. And the larger the sample, the better chance you have of getting a representative sample. Now, I'll tell you, like, just like very quick hints. There's kind of limits to this. Hang on, what do I have on my next slide? Okay, replication. We'll talk about that in a second. When we talk about like representative sampling, sort of the minimum you would ever want to aim for is about 400. You know, given a pretty large population group, like even say something as small as students at the University of Alberta, there's about 40,000. You would probably want to aim for at a minimum about 400. Like that's the bottom end of the scale. And that's particularly because below that, it gets really hard to do advanced statistical modeling on a sample below 400, right? You can get away with 300, but it's ugly, and anything below 300 is going to be really difficult. So, you know, when you're asked to provide kind of your logic behind a probability sample on the major lab, right? Like just think of 400 as your baseline, right? You don't want to go less than 400 generally. And you know, kind of a general rule is that about 1500 improvements in the quality of the sample in terms of representativeness, in terms of you know, degree of confidence and the degree of error start to get smaller and smaller. Like, so 1500 is considered in almost any population of no matter what size a really good size sample that you can pretty much say is going to be more or less representative. Beyond that, you do get improvements up to about 3,000, after which the improvements are just very, very small. Like, statistically not that significant. At about 3,000, right, you're talking about like a 98, 99% certainty rate, so a 1% margin of error, you know, 9 times out of 10. So it doesn't get, and it won't get much better. Like if you went and got 30,000, it would still only be, okay, you're 99.2, right? It doesn't get much better past 3,000. So you'll see, like if you're watching like the US election, that's gonna, do US elections ever end? I actually don't know. They just seem to go on all the time. The next one, whenever it happens, right, I guess it's happening in November, will be Donald Trump versus Joe Biden if he's still alive. I hope. Come on, you can do it. You'll see, right, that if you look at the polls, most of them are going to be in this range, right? You're going to be looking at, you know, between 1,500 and 3,000 for most national polls in the U.S. And and they're going to say like, you know, 2% margin of error 9 times out of 10, and that's in a country of 370 million. And if you went and got 30,000, it would still be roughly the same margin of error. It doesn't improve a whole lot beyond that. So, you know, you could probably get a larger sample in some studies, but you're not going to get that much better results. Yeah, John. Because it's typically just like the representativeness of the sample and the size, like you've already gotten close enough to like a perfect sample. So it will get better. Like if you manage to survey 1 million people, it would get better, but you're already so close to, you know, essentially fully representative that it can't get a whole lot better. And it becomes a question of, you know, do you waste resources surveying more people, or you just stick with a sample that is representative, you know, within 1 or 2%, right? Versus like 0.5%, is it worth expending? It's very echoey right there. Okay, I can hear myself talking and it's weird. So yeah, I mean, it's just in the kind of math, right? It won't get a whole lot better. And I'll show you a calculator later on where you can punch in like the size of your population and then the size of your sample, and it runs the math for you. There's formulas, but it just basically will not, like if you put, you know, 3,000 versus 30,000, you can see how small the kind of variance in terms of quality is. I mean, that's sort of like, okay, if it was 2,800, you're still dealing with roughly the same thing. Anything above 1,500, you still get improvements, it's just smaller and smaller. I'm trying to remember the exact mathematical reason, and it escapes me at the moment, but it's essentially that your population is big enough and close enough to representativeness that it just like, it will improve, but only by smaller and smaller margins. And the jumps are usually like 400, 800, 1,200, 1,500, 3,000 is usually the jumps people do. But yeah, that's, you know, I can't remember the mathy reason off the top of my head. I'd have to go look at the formula, and well, the size of the sample will tend to improve the randomness, right? But generally speaking, you want to get as much of a random sample as possible. You don't want to be selecting certain people, because then obviously, you know, you might not get valid results, right? Because you might be measuring within a certain subsection of the group. The goal is always, you know, for quantitative research, to get as close as possible to a picture of society, and the more random your sample is, the more likely you are to achieve that, right? Because you're not skewing the sample in any way. It's almost impossible to assure a completely representative sample, and it's getting worse. We'll get to this when we get to probability sampling, but when we used to do phone interviews, that was probably like in like the 70s, 80s, and 90s, or phone surveys, that was probably like the golden age, because you would just random dial phone numbers, and so you couldn't, and you would random dial them, like, say, all over Edmonton, and you couldn't really control for, you basically set it so it picked randomly in the city, so you got, you know, a random sample of people, hopefully from different socioeconomic backgrounds. That kind of broke down when call display was invented, and people got cell phones, so they could see who's calling, because nobody answers phone polls anymore, except me, because I'm still a good person and I want to help researchers. And I feel bad. But online samples have their own problems. They tend to be less representative, because you have to sign up for them actively, and so the people who sign up for them tend to be male, white, older, like middle-aged, right? People like me. Oh God, I am the sample. Anyway, so we've had a harder time with representativeness as time has gone on, and measurement tools have changed, because we can't get as random a sample anymore. So, you know, and even posting things on Reddit, like these psychologists from UC did, is not necessarily going to offer you the greatest results, because it's going to be Reddit users, and who uses Reddit? You know, white males tend to use Reddit a lot more on average. It's like something like 70% male population that uses Reddit. If you could get it on Pinterest, whole different story, right? Then you've got an inverted, then it would be all female. But anyway, sorry, I'm rambling for no reason. I'm gonna underline these people for some reason. All right. Okay. What else do we want? Replication, right? Replication, you want, you know, your findings to be replicable as much as possible. Basically, and there's a couple of obvious ways of doing this, right? To, you know, set it up so that someone can easily repeat your study, or provide your data in a sort of quasi-public or public forum, so that people can then ultimately use your data, check your data, and check whether you're interpreting it correctly, right? Yeah, if findings are not the same as the original study, the comparison provides a reason to reevaluate the methods of the original study. And yeah, if they're the same, you have good reasons. The marshmallow study is actually an interesting kind of example of this, right? So that was the one, I think I told you about it already, right? It's you put a kid in a room with a marshmallow, and you see whether they eat it, and, you know, if they don't eat it, they get, for 5 minutes, they get 2 marshmallows. And basically they did this experiment, and they gave kids a marshmallow. Some of them ate it, some of them didn't, and then they tracked them along, you know, for a few years to see what their life outcomes looked like. But in the original, and they said, wow, the kids who had more self-control did so much better in life. What they hadn't controlled for was socioeconomic class and racial background, right? So when people did follow-up studies and tried to replicate the findings to see if it worked, or if it held true, they were like, something's off, because we're getting very different results. But they had more closely kind of mixed their sample in terms of race and area, of the city that people came from. So replication, right, from a science, that's not an experimental design. From a research perspective, is a good thing, because if people could check your findings, right, it tends to make for better results. And it makes it less possible for people to make shit up. To put it kindly, I mean, I had my supervisor, who knows everyone, who's been around a long time. One of her co-collaborators, not my supervisor, my boss, she didn't supervise me, my boss, and she was telling me that, you know, one of her colleagues that she had worked with on a project wrote a bunch of papers and said that, you know, she found all of these things in the data, and it was very provocative. And then my boss was like, Unfortunately, it's all bullshit because I know that data and I also have control of the data and I know she never actually accessed the data. So she's just made up all of her results, right? And so, you know, sneakily my boss gave the data to someone else to write a paper discrediting her. Sneaky things that we do as academics, right? Because they're friends and she didn't want to, you know, confront her, so she made someone else do the confrontation, which is, you know, we're all passive aggressive at heart, right? We're Canadians. Anyway, that's what replicability, like if you rerun the data and you rerun the so-called statistical formulas, would you find the same things, right? Or would you find something else? Would you find errors people had made in math, right? Or statistics, or how they ran the statistics? You know, would you find maybe a spurious variable that they hadn't considered? These are, you know, replication is really important. It doesn't get done as often as we'd like. Like I know in psychology there's a replication crisis where a lot of studies are one-offs and people are like, yes, this shows that, you know, whatever. I don't even want to speculate on what psychologists would find. You know, and then people never follow it up. And so you get sort of big problems. Oh, there was this, what was it called? I think they called it the grievance study scandal, where people published a bunch of fake articles in journals, and basically, you know, they made up their data completely to prove that social science journals have a problem because nobody ever goes and checks the data or checks the replication, and it ended up being a big scandal. You know, that these 3 researchers had gone to prove that, you know, journals in the arts or or social sciences particularly have a very low bar of like checking data, and so they made up a bunch of fake papers, and especially I think it was in fields that they didn't like women and gender studies. Published them and then we're like, haha, we tricked you, nobody ever checks this data. That's the kind of thing we're worried about and we don't want to happen, right? Because we don't want to be embarrassed or people to doubt quantitative data or social science data in general. Okay, so there's lots of critiques of quantitative research as well, right? One of them, you know, fundamentally is that often quantitative research kind of fails to make distinctions. You know, it treats human beings and society as though it could be measured in the same way as the natural world, and in a lot of cases this isn't the case, right? Human beings, their motivations are much more complex, and you might see, you know, correlations on, you know, on a quantitative level that doesn't really explain why people do things, right? And so applying the kind of quantitative tool sets that you'd find in natural science, right, for non-conscious entities can be a problem, right? So, yeah, methods that study humans have to differentiate, you know, between, this is the kind of qualitative critique, should differentiate between those used to study natural phenomena. But, you know, quantitative researchers will suggest that humans are part of nature and there are patterns, right? There are patterns that we can detect if we have the right tools. Okay. Other critiques of quantitative research, you know, that wasn't a hand up. I thought you twitched and I like the dog from Up. I was like, squirrel. I just get so excited about questions. Yeah, measurement process can produce an artificial or false sense of precision and accuracy. Yeah, and sometimes, you know, the problem with some of the tools and with quantitative research is you never know how someone might interpret your questions, right? And in survey design, you know, when you're doing it, and once you get really, really good at it, you can mitigate that to some extent, right? But it comes down to writing really, really clear questions that are really, really hard to misinterpret. But you never know, right? Someone may come at it from a totally different point of view. And so, you know, we might have a sense that, oh yeah, we're really solid in we think we understand this phenomenon really well because we're measuring it. But it can be a little bit false because you never know how different people might interpret things, right? Okay, so actually here's there's a weird example, maybe. It comes from sociology of religion again. One of the big critiques in sociology of religion has been specifically that they often want to categorize religion in a Western way, right? So a lot of the questions that we've asked about, say, how religious are people is things like, do you belong to a religious congregation? Do you attend religious services? You know, how frequently you do so. one of the problems that we've run into as sociologists of religion is that as we get more and more cultural diversity, say in the West, or if we move those same tools over to other places, other people might interpret religion or the concept of religion in completely different ways, right? And some religions might not stress, say, attendance at religious services on a weekly basis, like Western religions like Christianity, Islam, and Judaism, right? And so it might be like you're trying to measure the religiosity of Buddhists, but those kinds of questions, once you start to have a lot of Buddhists in Canada, those questions might not actually capture how religious Buddhists are, because they don't go on a regular basis to a Buddhist temple, right? Or people who are Shinto. Yeah, please.
Is there like a space to make your question specific like that though? Because let's say you're trying to cater to a certain group of people, then it's fine to your questions relate to those people, or should they always be general? Or if you're giving a survey to students versus people that specialize in philosophy research.
Sure.
Then the way you word your questions to those types of people is different than just generally.
Of course. Now the problem is you have to be aware of the problem, right? So sometimes we might think that we have a really good tool set for measuring something like how religious people are, but we're actually missing a whole kind of way that people experience religion that's different from our conception, right? And so we might be like, wow, Canada's getting so much less religious. But what if it's just that you have a bunch of people who are moving in from places that have what Rodney Stark, my favorite, calls unchurched religions, right? They're religions that don't have this same kind of structure, or Chinese folk religions, right? Where you have a whole bunch of kind of religious practices that you do in the home. Some of those questions might not work, right? But you can have a false sense that, wow, Canada's getting so much less religious, but really you're just not measuring religion correctly, right? Your measure is kind of off, because you're actually measuring, let's say, how Christian is Canada. Oh, it's getting less Christian as the sources of immigration change. Does that kind of make sense? Okay. Yeah, sorry, oh, go ahead. Oh, maybe. You could, right? And some people do and some people don't, because some people will differentiate, between are you spiritual, and even then, if you ask people, are you spiritual but not religious, that can be a really difficult measure. How do some religious people will say they're not spiritual, and some people who aren't religious will say they're spiritual. Some people will say both. It's a really weird measure. Come take sociology of religion next year, and I will explain all of this to you in what I can only assume is painfully excruciating detail. No, I'm sure I spend too much time. Literally, I think we go a month on just concepts and theories, something which I'm sure all of my students deeply appreciated. But I also worship one of the sociologists, so it's a good time. I tried to make him into a stained glass icon, but it didn't work. Anyway, but sorry, does that answer your question? Okay. Yeah, religion is notoriously difficult to categorize, which is what makes it fun, and why I enjoy it so much. Okay. Yeah, other critiques. Yeah, reliance on instruments and procedures can produce a disjunct between research and everyday life. Specifically, right, it can overly abstract things. It can make things a little bit too abstract, right, and reduce human phenomena to these very, very abstract concepts. But can you then apply things outside of your context, right? If you manipulate independent variables of small facets of life, manipulating independent variables are small facets of life and it can have short-term effects, especially if you're talking experimental design. So the second point is all experimental design, right? If you manipulate, right, the music people are listening to while they try to do a math test, right, does that really speak to their life in general? Probably not. Maybe I'm really able to do work with heavy metal music on, just not in the scenario you presented it. Life is a long-term, ongoing, sometimes shifting social progress, especially for cross-sectional research, right? You can miss things that happen and change over time with this, kind of quantifying at a moment kind of way of doing things. And yeah, real life might be very different from what's recorded on a survey or what happens in an experiment. There are artificial environments too, right? When you have someone do a survey, you're putting them inherently in an artificial environment where they're answering questions about their life. And so it doesn't always give you a perfect picture. Okay. Yeah, I mean, okay, this is the absolute qualitative critique. The analysis of relationships between variables ignores people's everyday experiences and how they are defined and interpreted, right? Like, you can find a great correlation between two variables, but that doesn't always tell you, why people are doing things, how they interpret it. So it misses a whole human aspect, right? The relationship between single motherhood and poverty using a questionnaire will tell you, some relationship, but it won't tell you how single motherhood, the experience of single motherhood, what people actually experience as their single mothers, right? And so it misses an aspect. And so, I think I was telling you about the study I read before Christmas for one of my classes that I then put into the course, where they was talking about the correlation between, pornography use and declining religiosity. And one of the things that the researchers sort of admitted is, like, we know there's a correlation between these two things. We think this is the direction, but we really need some kind of qualitative research, or we need to talk to people to get their interpretation, because we're missing that aspect of, like, what is people's understanding of their own lives. And yeah, explanations for findings might not address perceptions of the people to whom they pertain, right? Valid quantitative findings, right? You can achieve them, but the conclusions don't often take into account people's motivations and feelings, what they think, right? And it's really difficult for quantitative research to actually do this, right? Like, some people will attempt to have open questions in quantitative research, but it complicates the process and it sort of blends into qualitative research. There's a weird draft right here, and I'm worried I'm not actually worried, it's just weird. I'm like, why is there air blowing through the ceiling? I don't know. I'm scared. Yeah, so categories for questionnaires are preset. Yeah, so, and sometimes you can fail in terms of setting up a questionnaire to find, everything. You might think you understand all of the things that are connected, but actually you're missing major things because you're not, actually talking to people. And talking to people is an interesting experience because sometimes they tell you really surprisingly interesting things that actually changes your thinking about a whole subject. So, right, I think that's, oh my God, there's another one. Okay, I thought that was the last one. Right, and quantitative research tends to think that it's objective, right? It has this positivist, objectivist sort of ontology and epistemology. But yeah, I mean, basically, it doesn't always take into account all the nuances that come in people's experiences. And it assumes that there is this social order that you can measure, and of course, qualitative researchers will often disagree, right? That everything is just perception. And yeah, so we get back to this debate that we talked about at the beginning of class. Okay. Oh, it's 3:03. This is seriously too early for me to let you go, and I know that's cruel. I'm going to open up another PowerPoint. I'm sorry. Oh, do you want to do SOC 100? No. It's so boring. I was bored with myself today. I went to sleep. No, I'm kidding, but I have to say, SOC 100 I've realized is, I would rather teach this class. Which I know you all find endlessly amusing. Don't worry, I'll tell you some horror stories when we get to interviewing that'll knock your socks off. I killed the screen, apparently. All right, duplicate. All right, let's talk survey research. This is one of my favorite topics, actually. For this class, I honestly, I love survey research. Okay, let's talk some survey research. We'll do a few, maybe we'll go 10 more minutes, and then we'll stop there. I love survey research. I love teaching people about how to write survey questions. It is so stinking hard to write a good survey. I know, it seems really easy because you've probably taken a bunch of surveys, but what you might not realize is how bad a lot of those surveys actually were. So let's see if we can teach you some stuff about survey writing. Okay, so surveys, like I said, are the most used tool in sociology. We do a ton of them, right? And these range from these little things like I was doing on Saturday on the phone or on my phone, as I was waiting for my daughter and her friends to finish their escape room. I was doing a survey on marital infidelity. I was helping people at University of Calgary. Anyway, They failed. They died in the escape room. Not really, but they failed at their task. They didn't want me to come in, or they certainly would have won. So, like, you could just wait out here. I'm like, great, super fun. Well, you don't get my help. Anyway, I'm not bitter, but it was very boring. So, all right, we use surveys a lot, and right, these go from like small surveys, like the one I was doing, all the way to the census, right? And things like the General Social Survey out of Newark, and all of these long, long surveys that we see that cover like the whole of society, right? So, you can kind of have two forms of questions on them. You know, open or closed format. And open format, right, is like what I was talking about in terms of open text boxes, or asking, tell us in your own words what you think. These are less common, right, because they're much more work and they're much harder to categorize. And I think if you're writing a survey, you need to have a really good reason to do this, right? Like a really good reason. Otherwise, I might sometimes put down that, offering an open question instead of a question with response set on assignments for this class, you need a good justification, or it can come off as a little bit lazy. Because it's like, I couldn't think of anything. So, open questions though, you can write whatever, or reply in whatever, I got like the hiccups, in whatever way you want, right? Now, like I said, when we talked about coding, depending on the size of your survey, these can be a massive disaster to try and code, right? I had 400 surveys in one thing that I did, and they had one of these boxes, and it took me like 2 weeks to code everything that people wrote. It was an absolute nightmare. But I was doing it by myself too, and I really realized later I should have asked for more money, but that's neither here nor there. So yeah, open questions, people write whatever they want. The much more common one is this, which is closed questions, right? And these are basically questions, present a fixed set of answers or alternatives, some kind of response set that people have to choose from, right? And I think only in very rare circumstances should you put other as a category, but we'll talk about that later. Okay. So open questions, what are the advantages? They're annoying. No, obviously, allows replies that you might not contemplate, right? So obviously with closed questions, they're only answering in ways that you think should be possible for them to answer. Obviously open questions, they can answer however they want, which can be really useful. You can get at people's unprompted, knowledge, things that you don't know, right? So unknown unknowns, to put it in Donald Rumsfeld's terms, are something you could find out in these questions, right? And often you do find things that people will offer that you didn't know, and they'll tell you some interesting kind of facts or thoughts or whatever it happens to be. You can kind of tell sometimes in the tone of how people answer them, how important they find something to be, how much knowledge they have about it, how strongly they feel about something, which you couldn't necessarily always get, in a closed question. Sometimes, especially, this last one, you can generate fixed choice format answers from it. Sometimes what people will do, before they conduct a survey, is they'll conduct like a pilot survey, where basically they would pilot and they would sort of ask maybe, some number, I don't want to say, maybe 10, 15 open questions in a kind of pilot survey that they give to a limited population. Especially, if you are moving into uncharted waters where you feel like you don't know what you want to ask, you could use these then to generate fixed choice answers, right, or closed questions. So sometimes I've seen people do that, where they pilot, a bunch of kind of general topics and they ask people to, just fill out what they know. And then from there, you can be like, okay, these are the themes I see, and then you can generate some questions from them on future surveys, right? Not on the survey you're doing, because maybe with AI, you might actually be able to do that, but, not at the moment. Yeah, please. Oh, definitely, yeah. I've done it. I only had one. I had a bunch of 30 closed questions and one open one. So you definitely can do it. And people frequently do. And sometimes it's is there anything else you would like us to know, right? Is a really common open question. Like, is there anything we missed? Is there anything else you want to tell us about this topic? But you can definitely combine them. Too many of the open ones is, again, it depends on your sample size, can become a nightmare to deal with the data because it's very complex. Again, I wonder if AI could deal with it for me. Now I have thoughts. So disadvantages, much more time consuming, right? And the answers have to be coded. It's less convenient, so less convenient to compose an answer. And this is mostly on the respondent side, right? If you have open boxes, what tends to happen is either people, write a lot, or they write like 2 words, right? Or like, yes, sure, nah, not really. Or really short staccato kind of sentences, because it's less convenient for them, right? It's harder for them to do, it's more time consuming. It can be, difficult in that particular way, right? So it's less convenient to compose an answer. And if you have too many of them, right, you're going to get desistance, right? You're going to get people kind of dropping out of your study in large numbers because they're going to start and it's going to be like, man, this is too time consuming and difficult. I don't want to do this. So I think can be used sparingly. If you're doing like in-person interviews, right? So like, in-person surveys, right? Let's say you're giving, and these are rare, but I say this literally, like I said, the team I work with, they're not mine, they're my bosses. They're doing these in prisons, right? And because there's no way to get incarcerated people to answer surveys online, we actually have to go and sit with them and talk it through. In that case, right, they require transcribing. In most cases now, if you're doing like an online survey, I guess if you were doing a phone saver too, you'd have to transcribe those things and then code them from there. So in like phone and in-person formats, they obviously require transcribing, which, is not the biggest deal, but, it's a pain nevertheless. Face interviewer variability, right? Sometimes, depending on who is interviewing people, right, in prisons, or like in an in-person survey or on the phone, depending on the questioner, it can actually lead to some variability in how people answer and how people ask the questions. So you might not always have the most reliable, interviewers in the sense that they're not always doing things the same way. They might have different tonality, they might ask it in different ways. They might be less forceful in how they ask the questions, all of which can kind of change if people answer them or how people answer them. And again, this is only for like in-person or phone interviewing, or phone questionnaires, or in-person questionnaires, which are becoming increasingly less common, but it definitely existed more back in the day. Okay, I don't know why this Liam Neeson thing made me laugh. So closed questions are much more typical, right? They're much simpler to compose, they're much simpler to deal with. You can go from getting your survey done to statistical analysis really, really quickly, so that's all super helpful, right? So it minimizes closed questions because you're like, even if you're doing it in person or on the phone, right? There's going to be less inter-interviewer or intra-interviewer variability and inter-interviewer variability, right? So the same person doing it over and over again is going to do it the same way, and 2 different people are going to do it the same way as well, because you're just like, what do you think about Pierre Poilievre's recent appearance on CBC? Do you like it? Not like, you're just gonna ask the question the same way, because it's the same question over and over again. There's not room for interpretation or you jumping in or anything like that. They tend to make it easier to understand questions because the answers are provided, right? So for the person doing the survey, they can probably get a general sense of what the question's asking from what the options are that they're being given, assuming that you don't write the world's longest questions. They can be, you can do them quick and easy, right? Which really cuts down your response rate issues, right? If all you're doing is selecting boxes, you can do them really, really fast. And you can ask a lot, you can increase the volume of questions that you ask. And so you can have more indicators, right? If you have questions that are really simple, really quick to go through, you can have more indicators, which means you're going to have a richer data set, So closed questions are totally where it's at, as far as I'm concerned. Much easier to work with, and you can go and start analyzing them, the day after your survey closes without having to do any futzy transcription or coding work, which is super, super helpful. All right, I said I was going to go 10 more minutes. It's been 10 minutes. We'll pick it up here. We're ahead of schedule anyway, so I'm gonna put a little star here for myself so I remember where I was. Yeah, on Wednesday we're gonna keep going, and I'll see if I can find you some really, really excellent and really terrible survey questions, and then we can talk about in class what is wrong with them, and we'll go from there. All right. Have a good evening. We'll see you on Wednesday. Oh, there is a lab tomorrow. Just remember that, right? There is a lab tomorrow. There absolutely is. So remember to go if you're planning on going. And then the second mini lab is going to be due Sunday at midnight. It's too in the weeds, right? So
Thank you very much.
yeah, no problem.
Question about the movie lab.
Very good.
So I was just wondering, because I did get the feedback about my question being too broad, so I just wanted to
Okay.
like if you have the time.
Yeah, no,
Okay, so here I can show you. So this is my question. I was wondering if I should just completely scrap it and start over again, or because it is quite broad, and just start with like a simpler one, or is there any way that I could?
you just said it's too broad.
Yeah.
Yeah, so what is there something that you want? Like you can have a good one. Is there like some aspect of the Romani people? Like are you interested in say looking at rates of poverty and imprisonment or level of education, and poverty or in criminality or in being in the Romanian prison system, right? Yeah, you need like at least a couple of variables, right?
That's the thing though, like could you do multiple variables or is that too complex? Because there is like I don't think you can narrow it down on.
Oh no, you could do you could do multiple variables, and frankly, you probably want to, right? Because you're dealing with a really complex social question, right? So it might. I mean, you can definitely start over if you want, and if you want to send me, your revised one, I can give you some feedback on it again, or just come talk to me after class, or whatever. But I think you can take this and dig in on it, come up with some variables that you're interested in that relate to, Romani people and why they end up in prison. You just have to have what explains like okay, you have to have some idea what you're looking for, right? Like it could be like socioeconomic factors, right? You can still be kind of vague-ish with it, right? But it has to be like what are you looking at? Are you looking at like socioeconomic, socioeconomic class, like discrimination, right? Like what factors interest you in terms of this particular question? Because otherwise, it's like when it comes to operationalizing this question, you're gonna be like, what the hell am I even asking, right? Like, what am I trying to measure, and how am I going to measure it, right? Does that make sense, right?
Yeah.
Like, how am I going to measure what?
Yeah, no, I know. Yeah, that makes sense. No, I was like, because I was writing the mouse coming back from Calgary, so I was like, I don't have time to like finalize this, so I was just like, I have to hand in something.
Yes.
But yeah, and do you think this qualitative is the best way to measure? Because just I was like thinking,
Like quantitative or qualitative?
sorry, quantitative, like just because I was thinking about like different variables that you could, and I feel like I don't know if it could fully be answered through quantitatively, if it's more for like a mixed.
Yeah, so I'm a mixed methods person,
Yeah.
so I'm going to say no question can ever be fully answered quantitatively or qualitatively. There's always, space for both methods, especially in something like this, right? I think, yeah, you definitely, there's multiple kind of ways of approaching this question. And I think, going to talk to Romani people would definitely be, interesting, and especially those who've been incarcerated. By the way, impossible to do. I'm sure the Romanian government would never let you in.
Oh, well, Romania. Maybe they'll.
Maybe.
Maybe. Really? Do you think they'd be? I because I was very curious because I am Marines. I've had experiences. I grew up there for a little while,
Okay.
and I just like there was so much. Like they don't really talk, but it's so blatant like racism that I've like never like I would actually like my grandma would not let me play with the Manichu because they're like visibly you could kind of tell.
Right.
Or like there's like certain areas within the city where I was from, they were like kind of like the ghettos for lack of a better word. They were like where they were segregated.
Right,
Like that's
yeah.
like it's so normalized in a way. So I was always found it like it's always been a topic of interest. And
Yeah.
I don't know.
I mean, I wonder. It might be. I just tend to think like
Yeah.
governments like to keep some of those things quite
Fair
not
enough.
on the
Because
surface.
I know I tried to like look up because it's like crazy like the incarcerate like the overrepresentation. I was like
It's
that
like
is,
indigenous people here.
it's, yeah,
right?
it sounds like it's crazy.
Yeah, like I don't think I've ever seen Romania specifically. I know Bulgaria has similar issues
it's
where it's like
very-
60% of the prison population is Roma. The Czech Republic, I think, had
It's,
or
I think it's
Czechia.
very common in like just Eastern Europe.
Central and Eastern Europe,
Central
yeah.
and Eastern, yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. I know the Russians really didn't like them when I was there,
No,
but it wasn't their central. Like
Yeah.
they didn't like them, and they told you to be careful of them, especially like around tourist traps because they'd pickpocket you.
Yeah.
But it wasn't like an overwhelming thing. They were much more suspicious of like Chechens, to be honest.
Really?
Oh yeah, no, 100%. It was like black. They called them black. You look at a Chechen, you don't think black, but to Russians, that was a black person. Right?
Yeah.
It was a weird social construction.
Yeah.
You know, it showed me a movie, which I was like, they're like the same color as you, like slightly Mediterranean looking. I'm like,
Yeah.
they don't look black to me, but okay.
Yeah.
Apparently, you can tell the difference. And yet, weirdly unconcerned about all of the like kind of they would say Mongol features, which was like
Oh, yeah.
you know almost like Asian, right?
Yeah.
Like tan skin,
Yeah.
you know, eye shape that's kind of more
Mhm.
classically Asian. They were just like, yeah, those people are fine. They're from like Yakutia. Who cares about them?
Yeah.
And I was like, I don't understand what's happening in this country. It's what a weird place. Anyway, I'm rambling because I'm tired. I think you just have to pick, like, if you want to stick with a research question like this, you have to pick what you're going to measure, right? Like, are you thinking socioeconomic? Are you thinking educational? Are you thinking all of them, like socioeconomic, educational, like, you know, discrimination? But then how are you going to
That's the
operationalize
thing.
discrimination?
That's like quite difficult.
It's a tough one, right? You know, racism, discrimination are notoriously difficult to turn into operational kind of questions. There's definitely ways, right?
Yeah.
But it might not be what you want to take on as, you know, third-year undergrad course, trying to take
Yeah,
like
this
one
is-
of the hardest concepts in social science and define it in a way
Yeah.
that makes sense, right?
Yeah, this is gonna say like for the scope of this course, like I'm wondering if it's too complex to try to tackle it.
Yeah, I don't necessarily think going simpler is a mistake, right? Because,
Yeah.
you know, again, when it comes to, like, just thinking, I don't know if you've looked at the major lab, like when you have to provide a sample of your research tools, what kind of research tools are you going to be able to provide here, right? Most people go with survey questions, and I 100% endorse this because they're the easiest ones to
Fair
do.
enough.
But is this going to be conducive to writing survey questions? I can certainly think of how to do it,
Yeah.
but you might kind of struggle to be like, okay, you know, have you experienced racism? Okay, well, you know, it's not a terrible question, but
But it's not.
you know, you could, I can just see the multiple ways that it could land you in trouble, not trouble, but where you're going to kind of sit there 3 days before it's due and be like, I've really dug myself a hole here.
Yeah,
you know?
that's what I'm afraid of because I was like,
It happens, right? Where people are like emailing me 4 days before it's due and they're like, A, may I have an extension? B, I've decided to completely abandon the premise I've been working on since the beginning of the course. C,
yeah.
you know, so I think a really interesting question, obviously. It might be a little bit too hard as a beginner, right? kind of project.
Yeah, because I don't know. Okay, so I just switched into sociology and I switched into the honors, which is very bold.
Ooh.